Golden Age. Hollywood glittered with fame, but behind the studio lights and silk gowns were secrets no camera could capture. Not scandals of sex or stardom, but of blood. Mothers who controlled, daughters who betrayed, children hidden, and families erased to protect the brand. These weren't roles. They were real lives, edited for the spotlight. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on the legends you thought you knew, and the family secrets they fought to bury. This isn't gossip. It's history. Messier than fiction, and just true enough to haunt you. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. We uncover the stories Hollywood tried to bury, and you won't want to miss what's next. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in New York? Noon in Tokyo? I want to know who's out there in the dark with me. 1. Joan Crawford. It always starts with the eyes. Painted, widened, a little too bright, a little too alert. Behind Joan Crawford's famously sharp gaze was a hunger, not just for fame, but for control. And she got it. In an era when studios treated actresses like replaceable dolls, Crawford made herself indispensable. Her power came at a price. But it wasn't Crawford who paid it. Years after the final close-up, when the gowns were packed away and the studio gates forgot her name, a different kind of spotlight found her. Mommy Dearest, the memoir by her adopted daughter Christina, wasn't just a tell-all. It was a declaration of war from beyond the grave. In it, Joan wasn't a screen icon. She was a tyrant in shoulder pads. Christina painted a picture of nighttime beatings, manipulation, and cold ambition masquerading as motherhood. The public was split. Some called it revenge. Others called it truth. The most uncomfortable part? It didn't feel surprising. Joan's perfection had always been too perfect. Her public image had the precision of an ice sculpture, cold, sharp, and destined to crack under heat. Hollywood reeled, but secretly, it fed on scandal. And as always, it moved on. But the ghost of Joan Crawford didn't fade. She evolved. Into parody, into cautionary tale, into camp. And just as the dust seemed to settle, another voice, this time from a different starlet's child, emerged with a strikingly familiar accusation. Different actress, same century, different pills, same mother. 2. Judy Garland. Judy Garland never stood a chance. She was a product first, a person second, maybe third if you count the studio's bottom line. Before she could vote, she was property. Her mother, Ethel Gum, made sure of that. Ethel was what polite biographies call ambitious. Less polite ones use stronger words. She brought Judy, then still little Frances Gum, to Hollywood, smiling like she'd just won the lottery. And in a way, she had. Judy's voice was golden. Her presence, electric. And MGM knew it. They just didn't want her looking human. So they starved her. Literally. Studio executives kept her on a rotating schedule of pills. Uppers to work, downers to sleep, and diet drugs to shrink the teenage baby fat. Judy was told she wasn't pretty. Her nose? Wrong. Her body? Too much. Her mother? Silent. Or worse, complicit. Judy would later say that her mother was the real wicked witch of the West. But those words came years after the damage was done. After Judy collapsed on stages, in marriages, in bathrooms across the world. Fame had made her visible, but not safe. Still, the most heartbreaking part wasn't just what was done to her. It's that she kept singing. Through the pain, through the fog, like she still believed there was a place over the rainbow, somewhere safer, kinder, quieter. And yet, for another luminous star just a decade later, it wasn't kindness that brought scandal. It was love, or the appearance of it. And in that story, the world didn't just whisper, it screamed. If you're still with me after that, you're my kind of listener. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of these untold stories. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Let's see how far these secrets are traveling. 3. Ingrid Bergman. Ingrid Bergman had the kind of face that made nations forgive things. A symbol of purity on screen. Luminous, elegant, untouchable. She played saints, nuns, wives, and war heroines with the kind of conviction that made audiences believe in the myth of goodness. But off-screen, when the script veered away from expectations, the fallout wasn't cinematic. It was political. In 1949, Bergman became pregnant by Italian director Roberto Rossellini. The problem? She was still married, not to him. What followed was less a scandal and more a cultural meltdown. The U.S. Senate denounced her. Preachers condemned her. Letters poured into studios from outraged citizens demanding morality. A Tennessee senator called her a powerful influence for evil. Theater owners pulled her films. One minute she was everyone's favorite dream, the next, public enemy in pearls. Bergman didn't grovel. She left, moved to Italy, had her child, and kept making films. Years later, when the moral temperature cooled and America realized it preferred starlets with a bit of rebellion, she was welcomed back. She even won another Oscar. But something had shifted. Not in her, in us. Bergman had exposed the machinery. The myth of perfect women carefully manicured by studios and clung to by audiences was just that. Myth. And once shattered, it couldn't be unbroken. Still, if Ingrid's scandal was about defying domestic expectations, the next one burned hotter, because it didn't challenge the family image. It tore it apart in blood, courtrooms, and a flashbulb-lit teenage confession no one could look away from. 4. Lana Turner. Lana Turner was built for drama. From soda fountain discovery to silver screen stardom, her life was tailor-made for headlines. But in 1958, she became the headline. And it wasn't fiction. Turner had a type. Dangerous men with expensive suits and cheap tempers. None more so than Johnny Stompanato, her boyfriend. A man with a criminal record, mob ties, and a habit of making scenes. Their relationship was volatile, and the studio knew it. But Lana was box office gold, and gold excuses a lot in Hollywood. Then came the night. A confrontation in Turner's Beverly Hills home. Raised voices. Threats. A kitchen. A knife. And Lana's 14-year-old daughter, Cheryl Crane, standing in the doorway. By the end of the night, Stompanato was dead. The official story? Cheryl, trying to protect her mother, acted in self-defense. The courts agreed. The public? Not so easily. Newsstands couldn't print fast enough. Was Lana the victim? The manipulator? The real one holding the knife, metaphorically or otherwise? No one could quite decide, which is how the story stayed alive. Turner wept publicly, accepted condolences, gave haunting interviews. But behind the scenes, her relationship with Cheryl strained under the weight of what they'd both lived through. Years later, Cheryl would write a book. Hollywood, as usual, cashed in on trauma. But the damage wasn't theatrical. It was generational. And if Lana's scandal had the messiness of noir, the next story had the calculation of a cover-up. Because sometimes the biggest lie isn't who you love, it's who you say your child is. 5. Loretta Young. Loretta Young wore morality like a tiara. Sparkling, visible, and heavy. She was the poster girl for virtue in a town that barely remembered what the word meant. Her films celebrated purity, her interviews oozed modesty, and her reputation remained spotless for decades. But behind the soft-spoken charm and primly folded hands was a story meticulously buried, one that didn't come fully to light until long after her final close-up. In the mid-1930s, Loretta starred alongside Clark Gable in a romantic drama. During filming, she became pregnant. Gable was married. The studio was nervous. Loretta was terrified. not of motherhood, but of the public. So she disappeared. She vanished from the spotlight for months, re-emerging with a curious new story. She had adopted a baby girl. Few questioned it. After all, Young was known for her charity. But the truth was far more calculated. The child, Judy Lewis, was hers, biologically, and Gable's. The adoption was staged, the paperwork arranged to perfection. Even Judy wasn't told the truth until adulthood. Loretta, torn between her faith and fear of scandal, had created the perfect illusion. Saintly mother, charitable woman, untouched by Hollywood's moral quicksand. The mask never fully slipped during her lifetime, but it cracked just enough to let the light and questions in. A devout Catholic hiding a child, a symbol of virtue orchestrating a lie. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a fable in reverse. And while Loretta concealed a child to protect her image, another screen legend would be undone by a child revealing hers, with a pen, a publisher, and timing as cold as the mother it portrayed. 6. Bette Davis. Bette Davis didn't raise eyebrows, she raised hell. With her sharp tongue, theatrical stare, and a refusal to be anything but unapologetically difficult, she carved out a place in Hollywood where women were expected to smile and stay silent. She didn't do either. But for all her on-screen fire, Davis's most explosive role didn't play out under studio lights. It unfolded in bookstores. In 1985, while Davis was recovering from a series of strokes and a mastectomy, her daughter, B.D. Hyman, published My Mother's Keeper, a memoir that read like a formal disowning. The pages dripped with accusations. Bette was controlling, verbally cruel, and selfish beyond measure. B.D. claimed her childhood had been shaped by her mother's need for dominance and drama. The public was stunned. Davis had always been formidable, but this was something else. A daughter's betrayal written in hardback, released while her mother's health was visibly failing. Some called it brave, others called it unforgivable. Davis, always quick with a retort, issued her own, a letter to B.D. that ended with a single phrase. "I am so glad I gave birth to you. Now I hope you can learn to live with that." The irony was thick. Bette Davis, the queen of emotional extremes, now cast as the villain in a family tragedy penned by her own blood. And while she never publicly reconciled with her daughter, she never sued her either, perhaps knowing that even she couldn't out-drama this script. But if Bette's legacy was challenged by the written word, the next scandal nearly exploded off the page, because some diaries aren't meant to be opened, especially in court. 7. Mary Astor. Mary Astor looked like a woman who kept secrets, the kind with velvet gloves and razor edges. On screen, she played elegant wives and sophisticated mistresses, but off-screen, she became the lead in a courtroom drama that made even Hollywood nervous. It was 1936, and her bitter custody battle with ex-husband Franklin Thorpe turned into a media circus. Not because of the child at the center, but because of a little leather-bound diary. The so-called Purple Diary was allegedly filled with Mary's most private thoughts, and some less than flattering descriptions of her lovers, including prominent public figures. Thorpe threatened to use it against her in court, arguing it painted her as morally unfit for motherhood. The press had a field day. Hollywood braced itself. Rumors swirled about the names inside, directors, actors, maybe even politicians, but the judge kept the diary out of evidence. Still, enough of its contents had leaked to feed months of speculation. Mary's image teetered on the edge, but her talent ultimately held. She won the case, and an Oscar years later. But the scandal lingered like smoke, not because of what was proven, but because of what was hinted at and never confirmed. Astor's fall and recovery showed that in Hollywood privacy was a luxury and perception was power. But for some stars, even winning in court doesn't stop the quiet theft of a life, especially when it's stolen by someone who promised to love, protect, and manage you. 8. Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge had the kind of beauty that left rooms breathless and producers scrambling for new scripts. She broke barriers with grace, walked red carpets where few black actresses were allowed to stand, and carried herself like she belonged in every room. Because she did. But behind the glamour, Dorothy's story was riddled with betrayals not from the industry but from her own home. Her second marriage, to hotel manager Jack Dennison, was supposed to be a turning point, a symbol of stability. Instead, it marked a financial and emotional unraveling. Dennison controlled more than her heart. He got involved in her money, her business decisions, and eventually her debts. By the time their marriage ended, so had much of Dorothy's financial security. But the deeper heartbreak lay in her struggle for her daughter, Haralyn. Born with severe developmental issues, Haralyn required care Dorothy could barely afford. Institutions replaced family. Doors closed. Friends faded. Dorothy, once the first black woman nominated for Best Actress at the Oscars, found herself fighting battles the cameras never saw. It wasn't just Hollywood that failed her. It was those closest to her. The men who promised partnership. The systems that promised support. The legacy that promised recognition, but paid in silence. Dandridge's life never got the third act redemption it deserved. But her name endured. Her strength endured. And yet the next scandal didn't simmer. It detonated within the walls of a strained family where discipline, legacy, and silence formed a house built not of love, but control. 9. Barbara Stanwyck. Barbara Stanwyck didn't smile unless it served a purpose. She built her legend on toughness. That icy kind of glamour you couldn't fake, and no one dared question. But behind the cool exterior and precision-cut performances was a family story that rarely made the press releases. It didn't need to. It leaked out in whispers, interviews, and one very public estrangement. In the 1930s, Stanwyck and her husband adopted a son, Dion. To the outside world, it looked like the perfect family accessory for a rising star. But as Dion grew older, cracks in that image turned into fault lines. He later claimed his childhood was cold and suffocating. More boarding schools and nannies than hugs and bedtime stories. Stanwyck, he said, ran her household like a studio lot. Structured, distant, and quietly merciless. By the 1950s, the estrangement was complete. Dion told reporters he hadn't seen or spoken to his mother in years. Stanwyck never publicly addressed the fallout. She simply erased it, the way she erased parts of her own past. The woman who'd survived a brutal childhood, abandoned by her own family, had somehow replicated the same cycle. And in Hollywood, that kind of symmetry doesn't go unnoticed. Stanwyck never remarried, never reconciled, and left behind a legacy of strength wrapped in silence. But if she ruled her home like a set, the next actress never got the chance, because the person pulling the strings wasn't a husband or son, but her father. And his version of love came with a spotlight and shadows she never outran. 10. Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth danced her way into America's heart. Hips hypnotic, smile luminous, timing flawless. She was the fantasy in Technicolor, the pinup on every soldier's wall, the woman who made you believe in magic just long enough to sell a ticket. But behind the stage name, the dyed hair, and the reinvention was Margarita Carmen Cancino, a girl trained to perform before she could pronounce her own name. And the man leading the choreography? Her father. Eduardo Cancino wasn't just her dance teacher. He was her manager, her first dance partner, and the architect of her early career. Their act, the Dancing Cancinos, toured nightclubs when Rita was still a teenager. He controlled everything, her image, her bookings, her future. But it was more than control. It was dependence, suffocation, and, as biographers would later describe, emotional domination that left lasting scars. Studio heads saw her potential and scrubbed her Spanish identity clean. They lifted her hairline, changed her name, and sold her as something new, exotic but not too exotic. marketable, palatable. Her father receded into the background, but his influence never left. Later in life, Hayworth would admit she didn't know how to be herself, only how to play parts. She once said, "Men fell in love with Gilda, but they woke up with me." It was less a lament than a confession. Because sometimes, when you're trained to perform for love, you never learn how to receive it. And for one actress, that performance began before birth, with a twist of fate, a handshake deal, and a pregnancy that had to vanish before the cameras rolled. 11. Jean Tierney. Jean Tierney was the kind of beautiful that made people suspicious. Too perfect, too poised. Even when she smiled, it looked rehearsed, not inauthentic, just conditioned. But beneath that polish was a tragedy so strange, so cruel, it felt like something Hollywood might have written and then discarded for being too unbelievable. In 1943, at the height of her fame, Tierney attended a charity event while pregnant. Among the crowd was a fan, eager to meet her idol. The woman had recently recovered from rubella but hadn't disclosed it, and didn't keep her distance. Days later, Tierney fell ill. Months later, her daughter Daria was born with severe developmental issues. The news devastated her. Tierney blamed herself. Then, years later, in a chilling twist of fate, the same fan approached her again. This time to boast about sneaking out of quarantine to meet her. It was a casual confession, offered without remorse. Tierney reportedly said nothing in return. What could she say? The damage had already been done. Her daughter's condition would reshape the rest of her life. Behind the gowns and premieres, there were hospital visits, mounting stress, and a quiet sorrow that no studio could spin into a headline. Jean Tierney kept working. She kept smiling. But something changed. The scripts felt thinner, the eyes sadder, and yet, in the endless Hollywood loop of image over truth, few ever asked her to explain. But while Jean's pain was born of chance and illness, the next actress's scandal came wrapped in romance, or what passed for it in the studio playbook. A marriage to a boyish superstar, a temper too big for the screen, and a tabloid storm waiting for its cue. 12. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner walked like she knew the room already belonged to her. Not out of arrogance, but out of inevitability. She wasn't just a beauty, she was a storm system in heels. Men pursued her, women studied her, studios packaged her. But Ava refused to be owned, except perhaps during one reckless chapter that looked like love, but felt more like a car crash in slow motion. She married Mickey Rooney at 19. He was the box office king, a studio darling with a grin made for mischief. She was the newcomer, Southern-born and sharp-witted. On paper, they were a Hollywood fairy tale. In practice, it was emotional whiplash. Rooney was volatile, impulsive, and by Ava's account, unfaithful to a degree that was almost cartoonish. The tabloids had a field day. MGM tried to keep the image clean, but the reality was unraveling faster than the studio could patch it. The marriage didn't last a year, but the shadow of it did. Ava went on to love and lose other powerful men, but her marriage to Rooney remained a blueprint for every romantic disaster that followed. Not because it ended, but because it had never truly begun on her terms. Ava once said, "I made a lot of mistakes, but I'm not sorry." And maybe that's true, but some mistakes leave bruises you don't see on the skin. Some teach you how to walk away before it's too late. And for one iconic actress, walking away wasn't just a lesson. It was a scandal. Because the man she took was someone else's husband, and America never forgave her for it. 13. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor was never subtle. Her eyes were violet, her diamonds were legendary, and her scandals came with front-page font sizes. But the one that broke the public's adoration into outrage wasn't about a dress or a role. It was about a man. Specifically, someone else's husband. In the late 1950s, Taylor was mourning the death of her third husband, producer Mike Todd, when Eddie Fisher, her close friend and, inconveniently, the husband of America's sweetheart Debbie Reynolds, stepped in to comfort her. Comfort became companionship. Companionship became headlines. And soon, Fisher was filing for divorce. The backlash was swift. Elizabeth, once cherished for her beauty and boldness, was suddenly painted as a homewrecker, a seductress, a threat to the sanctity of celebrity marriages everywhere. Studios panicked, publicists spun. Reynolds played the wounded angel to perfection. But Taylor didn't flinch. "You can't break up a happy marriage," she said, with a smile that could cut glass. In other words, blame the man, not the woman who showed up second. Still, the damage was done, to reputations, to friendships, to the illusion of Hollywood innocence. And as Taylor moved on, and married Fisher, the story stuck. But while Taylor was condemned for stealing a husband, another young starlet was quietly losing control of her life, not to passion or grief, but to the unrelenting grip of the one person she should have been able to trust, her mother. 14. Natalie Wood. Natalie Wood never really had a childhood, at least not one she owned. By the time most kids were learning to ride bikes, she was learning how to cry on cue. Her mother, Maria, saw potential and pursued it with the precision of a stage manager and the desperation of a failed dreamer. Natalie's career wasn't a happy accident, it was a project. Maria didn't just push, she controlled. She decided what roles Natalie took, who she spoke to, even who she loved. One story, almost too on the nose to believe, claimed Maria once brought a stray dog to a movie set to make Natalie cry for a scene, then threatened to take it away if she didn't deliver the performance. The lines between motherly ambition and emotional manipulation were so blurred, they might as well have been scripted. Natalie played the part of the perfect daughter, the talented ingenue, the poised young star. But behind the smile, there was exhaustion, quiet rebellion, and a deep-seated fear of disappointing the one person she was never allowed to question. Later, as an adult, Natalie would struggle to carve out her independence. In love, in motherhood, and in the business that had claimed her before she had a say. Her story was glittered with success but shadowed by the question, who was she, outside of her mother's design? And yet, even her story seems tame next to what came next. A family dynamic so bizarre, it felt less like a Hollywood upbringing and more like the plot of a Gothic novel, complete with a mother who never let go and a daughter who could never quite breathe. 15. Jean Harlow. Jean Harlow may have been Hollywood's original blonde bombshell, but behind the peroxide and silk gowns was a deeply strange and stifling home life that no amount of fame could glamorize. She was known for playing vamps and vixens, but off-screen, Jean lived under the ever-watchful eye of a woman who called herself Mama Jean, a mother so entwined in her daughter's life that it bordered on obsession. Mama Jean didn't just manage her daughter's career, she managed her thoughts, her finances, her friends, and even her marriages. She often accompanied Jean on film sets, monitored her conversations, and was known to insert herself into the most personal parts of Jean's world. The dynamic was less mother-daughter and more stage manager-lead actress, with a script that only Mama Jean got to edit. Their relationship became the stuff of Hollywood legend. Some said Jean craved her mother's approval so much that she never made a decision without her. Others claim Mama Jean saw her daughter as a second chance at the stardom she herself never achieved. Either way, the emotional hold was suffocating. When Jean died tragically young, it was Mama Jean who took control of the narrative and the estate. The lines between grief and ownership blurred fast. But if Jean Harlow's life was marked by an overbearing mother, the next story belongs to an actress whose children, in the end, didn't remember her with devotion, but with disillusionment. A woman whose Hollywood legacy glittered far brighter than the way she was remembered at home. 16. Veronica Lake. Veronica Lake had the kind of face that could stop traffic and a hairstyle that accidentally launched a national trend. Cool, sultry, and detached, she became the blueprint for film noir femininity. But once the cameras stopped rolling, the real Lake lived a life that was anything but smooth. Fame came quickly, and so did the unraveling. Behind her detached on-screen persona was a woman dealing with battles no studio could package. Lake's personal life was turbulent, but the most haunting part wasn't the divorces or the tabloid headlines. It was the growing distance between her and her children. Over time, the relationship eroded so fully that by her later years, she was effectively estranged from them. There was no Hollywood ending, no last-minute reconciliation. Lake struggled with alcohol, financial instability, and the brutal realization that Hollywood had moved on. In her memoir, she recounted her journey with stark honesty, not for redemption, but for record. She acknowledged the pain she caused and endured, but the scars ran both ways. Her children rarely spoke of her publicly, and when they did, it wasn't with the warmth you'd expect for a woman once hailed as a goddess of the silver screen. If Veronica Lake's legacy faded into silence, the next story is one of conflict so persistent it became famous in its own right. A family feud where love wasn't lost, it was thrown out, denied, and decades later, still unresolved. 17. Carole Lombard. Carole Lombard was known for her sharp wit, fearless performances, and a kind of screwball charm that made audiences fall in love effortlessly. She was a woman ahead of her time, bold in her choices, generous in spirit, and disarmingly honest in a town built on illusion. But even Lombard, who could go toe-to-toe with any leading man, couldn't escape the complications that came with family, especially when love clashed with blood. When she fell in love with Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood, it was more than a tabloid dream. It was a genuine, palpable connection. But behind the scenes, Lombard's own mother wasn't exactly thrilled. Elizabeth Peters, her fiercely traditional and strong-willed mother, reportedly disapproved of the relationship from the start. Maybe it was the age difference. Maybe it was Gable's previous marriages. Or maybe it was that her daughter, once entirely hers, now belonged to someone else. Their disagreements became increasingly tense. It was more than motherly concern. It was a full-blown feud. Lombard found herself caught between the man she adored and the mother who raised her. It strained more than just their Sunday dinners. But fate would make the final call in that story. And while Carole's conflict ended in tragedy, the next actress was born into tension. Not between mother and daughter, but daughter and dynasty. Because when your last name carries weight, rebellion isn't just expected, it's inherited. 18. Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead didn't just defy expectations. She danced on their grave. Born into a powerful Southern political dynasty, she was expected to follow a genteel, proper path. She chose Hollywood instead, and scandal, and cigarettes, and sharp-tongued honesty that made headlines faster than any performance she ever gave. Her father was Speaker of the House. Her uncles were senators and judges. Her family name was currency in Washington, and a liability in Los Angeles. They disapproved of her lifestyle, her politics, and especially her refusal to play the game. Tallulah wasn't just a rebel. She was a fire hazard with a martini and a microphone. The Bankheads tried to rein her in, but Tallulah wasn't having it. She lived loudly, dressed extravagantly, spoke openly, and scorched the rulebook at every turn. Her fame made her a darling in certain circles and a disgrace in others. Her family, mortified, tried to pretend she didn't exist. Publicly, at least. Tallulah wore their disapproval like a designer coat. Tailored, obvious, and occasionally tossed over her shoulder for dramatic effect. But while her family fought to disown her from a distance, the next Hollywood starlet faced something even stranger. A secret so basic it should have been boring, if it hadn't been completely fabricated. 19. Mae West. Mae West was never subtle. She didn't arrive in Hollywood. She sauntered in, dropped a one-liner, and stole the scene. With her unapologetic sexuality and razor-sharp wit, she bent the rules of propriety until they cracked, smiled through the backlash, and cashed the checks anyway. But even someone as bold as Mae had a secret. It wasn't scandalous in the usual way. It wasn't a torrid affair or a hushed courtroom settlement. It was simpler, and somehow stranger. Mae West lied about her age for decades, not just to the press or to fans, but to studios, colleagues, even government officials. The birth year on her official documents fluctuated depending on who was asking, and what roles she wanted to land. She shaved years off like lines in a script. By the time the truth finally emerged, that she was significantly older than she had always claimed, the public was stunned. Not because she had aged, but because she had gotten away with it for so long. The lie wasn't about vanity, it was about control. In an industry where youth was currency and age was a liability, Mae had rewritten the rules, and her own biography. And while Mae bent the truth to protect her career, the next story is a family saga built not on deception, but on rivalry. A tale of two sisters, two stars, and one lifelong feud where the Academy Awards were just battlegrounds in an ongoing war. 20. Olivia de Havilland. Olivia de Havilland was known for her grace, her elegance, and her ability to make even the most fragile characters feel unbreakable. But off-screen, she fought battles that had nothing to do with scripts, and everything to do with blood. Specifically, her sister, Joan Fontaine. The de Havilland-Fontaine feud wasn't just Hollywood gossip. It was a generational grudge match dressed in designer gowns. From childhood, the sisters clashed, competing for attention, roles, and eventually, Oscars. When Olivia won first, Joan reportedly offered a clipped congratulations. When Joan won later, she avoided Olivia's handshake at the ceremony. It wasn't petty, it was personal. Their rivalry wasn't about one incident. It was a slow burn, fueled by slights both real and imagined, by comparisons made by the press, and by a family dynamic that left little room for reconciliation. They went years without speaking. Interviews became battlegrounds. Each memoir drew new lines in the sand. Even in old age, there was no resolution. No teary reunion. Just silence, and the weight of decades left unhealed. And while Olivia waged her war with a sister who matched her in talent, the next chapter brings us to the other half of that feud. A woman who, for all her accolades, never quite shook the feeling of being second best. 21. Joan Fontaine. Joan Fontaine had elegance to spare and a face made for suspense, perfect for the haunted heroines she often played. But off-screen, she was navigating a drama far more intimate and far more painful. Her lifelong rivalry with her sister, Olivia de Havilland. In Hollywood, family feuds are usually temporary, but not this one. This one calcified. From the start, Joan lived in Olivia's shadow. Their mother reportedly favored Olivia, and Joan, born Joan de Beauvoir de Havilland, was left to carve her own path. So she did. She changed her name. She auditioned without introductions. She refused to ride the coattails of the sister who had always seemed to get there first. Then came the Oscars. Joan won in 1942 for Suspicion, making her the only actor to win an Academy Award for an Alfred Hitchcock film. Olivia clapped politely. The tension was visible. Years later, Olivia would win her own, twice. But the damage wasn't about trophies. It was about identity, about being seen, and never quite being enough. Joan accused Olivia of cruelty. Olivia denied it with dignity. Both kept the feud alive by never fully letting it die. In the end, they didn't just fight for the spotlight. They fought over the story of who had the right to claim pain. But while these two sisters battled for narrative dominance, the next actress made no apologies for rewriting her own. Because in her world, fidelity was flexible, Expectations were optional, and scandal was just another night on the town. 22. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich was smoke in a champagne glass, elusive, intoxicating, and hard to define. She didn't just bend the rules of femininity, she snapped them in half and walked away in a tailored tuxedo. Known for her sultry performances and worldly persona, Dietrich was more than an actress. She was a statement. And at home, her private life was just as unconventional as her public image. Dietrich maintained a marriage to Rudolf Sieber, but they lived separately for most of their adult lives. Friends, co-parents. A technical marriage, sure, but not a traditional one. While they remained legally bound, Dietrich had lovers, openly, unapologetically, both men and women. She didn't hide. She didn't explain. She simply existed as she chose to, daring the world to keep up. Her daughter, Maria Riva, would later write a detailed, and often scathing, account of life under Marlene's shadow. The book didn't vilify her exactly, but it didn't protect her either. Maria described a mother more invested in image than intimacy, someone whose charm was calculated and whose love often came with conditions. Marlene never publicly denied her daughter's version. She didn't need to. Her life had always been performance art, glamorous, cryptic, and just distant enough to remain untouchable. And while Marlene curated her myth with a velvet glove, the next actress ran from hers entirely, leaving behind not just Hollywood but her own family in a quiet rebellion no publicist could spin. 23. Kim Novak. Kim Novak always seemed to be on the edge of something, too beautiful to be ignored, too independent to be managed. In an industry that demanded submission, she gave them mystery instead. Her rise to fame looked effortless on the surface, but the real story was far less polished. Because before she ever stepped in front of a camera, she was already trying to escape something, her own family. Born to working-class Czech parents in Chicago, Novak was raised in a strict household that saw Hollywood dreams as frivolous. Or worse, dangerous. Her parents, especially her father, expected discipline, not ambition. But Kim had other plans. At just 20, she left home under the pretense of a modeling opportunity, eventually landing in Los Angeles, and rewriting her entire life along the way. Her family's disapproval didn't stop when the fame started. Reports at the time suggested ongoing tension between Novak and her parents, particularly over her career choices and relationships. She was known for avoiding the press, dodging invasive interviews, and keeping her private life tightly sealed. Perhaps because the real battles weren't on the studio lot. But at the dinner table back home, Kim Novak didn't just run from home, she ran toward reinvention. And yet, no matter how far she got from her roots, the echoes of that early control lingered. But if Novak's rebellion was a quiet act of defiance, the next story was anything but silent. It played out in courtrooms and institutions, where the line between protection and possession blurred beyond recognition. 24. Frances Farmer. Frances Farmer came to Hollywood with a head full of ideas and a heart full of resistance. She was the rare actress who read Nietzsche on set, challenged authority, and refused to play the part, off-screen or on. But independence, especially in women, was rarely rewarded in Golden Age Hollywood. And in Frances's case, it wasn't just the studio that pushed back. It was her own mother. Lillian Farmer, proud and controlling, wasn't just a parent. She was a self-appointed warden. As Frances began to show signs of emotional strain, it was Lillian who stepped in. At first, it looked like concern. Then it began to look like control. Over time, decisions about Frances's treatment, career, and even her freedom were filtered through her mother's judgment. Frances was institutionalized multiple times. Stories vary. Some accounts describe medical interventions gone wrong, others suggest coercion and neglect. Through it all, Lillian remained in the center of it, managing, signing forms, defending her choices. Frances, meanwhile, lost more than roles. She lost her agency. Later in life, Frances would return, older, quieter, battle-scarred. But the damage was irreversible. Her name became shorthand for a Hollywood tragedy. Not just of fame lost, but of family gone too far. And while Frances's scandal was forged in silence and confinement, the final tale hid behind a smile, one that charmed the public even as it masked an entire life kept secret behind closed studio doors. 25. Judy Holliday. Judy Holliday had a voice like a question mark, high, curious, disarming. She played dumb so well it became a brand, a weapon disguised as a giggle. But in real life, Holliday was anything but foolish. Sharp, political, and intensely private, she understood the performance behind the performance, which is why what she kept hidden for so long wasn't a scandal in the typical sense. It was the kind Hollywood hated most, a secret that didn't serve the narrative. Before her rise to stardom, Holliday married musician David Oppenheim and had a child. But as her fame grew, the studio grew nervous. They had already crafted her as the naive blonde, the wide-eyed girl next door who was always one step behind the joke. A marriage and a baby didn't fit the image, so she kept them quiet. Interviews avoided the subject. Public appearances were staged without them. And for a time, it worked. She wasn't estranged, abandoned, or disloyal. Just hidden. A starlet whose real life was too normal to be marketable. Her role as a mother and wife didn't sell tickets, so it stayed in the background, folded neatly behind the script. Years later, when the truth resurfaced, the public wasn't outraged, just surprised. But that was the point. In Hollywood, a well-kept secret isn't just survival. It's strategy. And with that, our curtain closes. Not on the scandals themselves, but on the strange, shimmering machinery that made them possible. A world where family was a script, motherhood was a plot device, and the truth was always negotiable.